and welcome. I'm Barbara Tien with Project Kim. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special program today. My guest is Cynthia Nims, who is joining me from Seattle, Washington, where she will be sharing with us something that just got me so excited. The idea of hosting a potluck as a way to solicit stories. We all talk about food all the time, and all the time, food brings up stories of family, love, memories, sometimes even tragedies, trauma, and the difficult stories. Cynthia has a unique perspective on food and the conversations around them, coming as she does as a food writer, a journalist, food writer, cookbook author, and deep into food culture today from Seattle, Washington. So, with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, Cynthia. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I am so thrilled to be joining Project Kin today and this conversation. This project I'm working on, I'll say the current version of this project I'm working on dates back probably 6 months or so, when the idea of focusing on the recipe box and on the potential treasure and story and memories that are to be found in a recipe collection, it really started to take on a new focus for me. I can tell a little bit more about that later, but basically I ended up calling this Long Live the Recipe Box, because it seemed like while we're inundated in recent years with countless, like truly endless supply of recipes, when it's like, we just want to cook something for dinner tonight, we're looking for some new ideas, the digital realm of recipes is enormous, which makes the recipes that mean something to us, the recipes with which we have a connection, I think end up being even more important, because there's such a beautiful counterpoint to the reality of the fact that, you know, the digital online sphere of recipes is growing and, you know, truly a natural part of our lives these days. So then again, preserving these recipes that really have connection and meaning just means that much more to us. I did bring out a couple of show and tell elements. This tattered recipe folder is the one that belonged to my mom. It's literally, I mean, it really is falling apart, and I hold my breath every time I bring it down from a shelf or pull it out for a conversation. This is really the touch point for me. I've had this in my kitchen for, I don't know, like 20 years now, since the time that my mom died. I was the one that became the caretaker of it. And for so long, I just thought of it as really a memento of my mom's. And it took me a few years to realize that it was actually a treasure that I could get a lot of value out of too. And so part of this recipe box work I'm doing is helping others sort of understand the treasure of these recipe collections. And I think I was so touched when Barbara reached out after the newsletter I wrote about the potlucks, to hear the degree of just enthusiasm that she had for the project. And that's the one thing about recipe boxes. Once you bring up the idea of cherished recipes, family recipes, memories associated with recipes, you can have some really rich and interesting conversations with people. So I love this idea of focusing on a potluck that is directed at the idea of gathering family, gathering stories, and getting impressions from people about, you know, about these recipes that we want to preserve and share and keep going for generations to come. So I'll say a little bit about what prompted that potluck post that I wrote. I have been in a Tai Chi class for years, and one day my Tai Chi teacher, who had seen some of my posts on Facebook about this recipe box work, she thought, hey, how interesting it would be to get some folks together from our Tai Chi group and just meet one afternoon on a weekend and share some recipes. So this sort of grew out of one experience last summer that was just so engaging and so just so enchanting almost to see what kinds of stories and connection it brought out. So the starting point of a potluck, or it came up in a conversation recently how many different terms there are. I'd be curious to hear the terms that some of you may be more familiar in your countries for. I'm forgetting some of them now, but the potluck, the idea of bringing dishes, everybody contributes a dish to a get together. It's one of the cool things is just the simple sort of unknown aspect of what dishes people bring. So I think when it's presented to a family group and you're working to collect and sort of spark some family stories, the sharing of some family recipes, I think that's one of the first sort of delightful unknowns is just going to be the sheer delight of seeing what people bring when they're given the option of bringing some dish with which they feel a connection, with which they feel a sense of memory. That's kind of half the fun, is just seeing what arrives and what sort of different perspectives folks have and different eras of life that maybe come to mind. It might be from a childhood memory, it might be from something more recent. So I think that's part of the fun of these potlucks, is just the delightful mystery of what's going to show up and what stories are associated with it. And I think that's the joy of having a varied group of people also, is, having different generations, maybe not only inviting your family that are already super engaged in food and recipes and gathering these stories. It's great to have them as well, of course, because you're going to be starting with some folks that have already been thinking about this and maybe have a particular recipe that leaps to mind that they would like to bring. And I think it can be equally, if not even more valuable for some of your family members that maybe aren't already tuned in to how deeply connected food can be to some of our memories and connecting us to loved ones, and again, sort of different eras of our life. So I think that's kind of an interesting consideration in terms of the group that you invite to be at a potluck, is again, sort of a mix of folks who are maybe already super super engaged in the connection between food and these stories, and maybe those that aren't. So variety in the attendees, and that's going to provide some variety and some really interesting diversity, I think, in terms of the engagement and the kind of dishes that are brought and the stories that end up coming from it. And I think one of the very most interesting things to me about this recipe box work in general is that even in conversations with friends and family, when food comes up, when recipes come up, and this question about, can you think of a few recipes with which, you have really strong connections, it sparks conversations that just might not happen to come up in other contexts. I think that's, again, one of the beauties of this sort of potluck approach, or this, think of a dish, a recipe, and bring it to share, is that it's very potentially going to spark conversations and memories and thoughts that might not come up otherwise. Food has a really sort of unique connection. How much like smelling things can, smelling a particular dish coming out of the oven, or, even thinking about a recipe can sometimes bring a visceral memory of a flavor. So I think that's part of the benefit of using this potluck and food and recipes context, is that, again, it could spark memories and things shared that just haven't come up before. I have some show and tell here. I wish I had a little more space for you to see it all spread out. This one is one of those examples of old, very sort of well-used, stained, tattered recipe cards. And it's one that I found in my mom's recipe folder. It's one of those millions of Jell-O based salads. But when I picked this out of the recipe folder a while back, when I really started diving in, I really and truly could taste this I remembered it from decades past. And I might be tempted to come up with a modern version of it. It's, you know, it's one of those Jello salads with a lot of spices and some applesauce and some nuts. But again, that visceral reaction I had when I saw this recipe card is such a perfect indication of the kinds of sentiments that a recipe can bring up, and the spark of sort of memory and occasions when mom might have served it, and chatting with my sister about that. Hey, do you remember that crazy red Jello salad that mom used to serve? Such a great spark for conversations. There are a lot of potential ways to approach a potluck. Obviously, we've all been to many over the years and maybe have favorite approaches. I think there's a few things to keep in mind when it's a potluck focused on this goal of some sort of family collection of stories and recipes. And even just thinking about what your particular goal for a gathering might be is a great starting point. There's just so many ways to approach it. It might be, at least for starters, maybe the first one of these that you organize might be relatively casual, and it's mostly about simply the opportunity to be together for a few hours, share, have people bring a dish that they've prepared, and be prepared to, share stories. It can be very sort of less structured in that way, and really about the time that you have together. There are times when you might want to take it to a slightly next level in terms of perhaps asking people to bring a copy of the recipe as well, so that there's, the dish to be enjoyed with others, shared, sparking stories that you tell, in person that day. But you may want to also do something of a recipe swap. That's an option for one version of a potluck. Or you might choose instead to still just have people bring the dish itself, and perhaps, part of the after, following the potluck, maybe there's a collection of recipes that happens after that. So the actual recipe itself, to what degree that's part of the sharing that day is something to consider, and an option for how you organize a particular potluck. And you could also consider different forms of capturing those stories. You've all been capturing family stories already, and maybe have preferred platforms or forms that might take, and maybe there's a particular approach you want to do with a potluck. So, it could be certainly video and photographs. You could have like a blank book, perhaps, that becomes a sort of family potluck journal. And perhaps if you might consider having multiples of these, you start with a blank notebook, and there's some, maybe there's a page for every attendee, and they can sort of capture a brief recap of their comments about the recipe. Or maybe that's where the recipe gets, added to a book too. There's ways that you could formally capture some impressions or some of the content from that particular gathering. And I love the idea of it possibly being multiples too. If you're imagining this being an ongoing project, and maybe there's different family groups and different times of the year, and maybe even different physical places you travel around and see family in different parts of the country, maybe that I can just see the treasure that a notebook, that has just sort of handwritten, additions over the course of different potlucks could be itself a family treasure. And maybe that becomes a document that is later somehow, copied and put together and shared with others. And the follow-up, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps, again, maybe it's just a moment in time. You enjoy that afternoon together. You have some great stories shared. It sparks interest in everyone to go home and maybe think more about their recipes and stories. That's possible. You could choose to have some follow-up elements, which again might be capturing, asking people to contribute recipes, or maybe the family already interacts on a particular platform where you you add this element of sharing recipes and stories there. Also, maybe it helps loop in people who couldn't be at the event. Hey, we have this great potluck. Here's some highlights, and then that becomes sort of an ongoing conversation in another platform that you're already using to interact with family. You could be taking photos, and I mean, there are just so many ways to go. So I think that's part of the fun of this. It can be informal, it can be more structured, it can be one time, it can be ongoing, but it's a starting point, using the potluck as just a spark. I mean, it's really a spark for the conversations, a spark for conversations that might not happen otherwise. And I think just it's such a delightful experience to connect with people over food, which we know because, I mean, that's the joy of meals around the table together. And this is taking it to another level where there's really some tangible value that can be nabbed and carried forward. I am just going to keep talking because I could talk for months about this. I think another important thing to remind people is that I think when we think about cherished recipes or recipes that represent family and memories, there might be a tendency to want to think of something like an important recipe, something that was like a centerpiece on the holiday table, or, the fancy cake that was everybody's birthday favorite, or, some, I don't know, recipe that feels that it's significant in some way, which is great. And I think, there's definitely a lot of value in preserving these important recipes that are sort of the highlights of all of our family memories. But there is so much room for what might be deemed an everyday recipe. So I think, especially again, for these folks in your family that might be less inclined to head to the kitchen and think of cooking as a way to preserve family memories and history, the folks who might just not have made that connection before to family and food, I would say to encourage them to think of anything that provides a sense of connection. And it could be, I mean, someone at this potluck brought bagels and cream cheese and smoked salmon, which is a composition of things. It's not exactly a recipe. And I think there should be room for that too. And honestly, I don't know, just for me, that what came to mind, this is not a recipe at all, but maybe there's room for it, is a box of Triscuits and one of those packages of that old cheese, I don't mean old cheese, but remember the cheese that's sort of it's soft and spreadable and it has a little swirl of port in it, that was such a fancy thing on a lot of our, holiday tables. And I have a soft spot for that. So granted, it's not a recipe and maybe not appropriate for every, one of these sort of, it's not a recipe that necessarily is going to go into a cookbook or recipe book that you're putting together. But I think that's another thing to consider, is not just recipes per se that have ingredients and a method, but foods that evoke memory too. Sure. And maybe I would say to allow space for that to perhaps be someone's contribution as well. And maybe that sparks some other similar memories or some fun idea to, like, let's come up with a sort of a modern version of that, or play around with some of these food memories that can maybe become something new and something a little more updated. This is, I think everybody, I know Barbara, you've mentioned this too, this is one of my most cherished memories of things that my mom made. It's probably going to be hard to see because it's plastic, but this is an old bag of ocean spray cranberries. And that is, that quintessential orange cranberry relish that I still make pretty much exactly as it is on the bag, except I use so much less sugar. But my mom made this every year. And for the longest time, I thought it was some special recipe of hers, not because she pretended that it was, but I just thought it was yummy and mom made it, so it has to be special, until I found it right here in her recipe folder. And there, this has a story for me, even though it's a recipe that 6 million people have made over the years or more. I don't know, making that number up, but to me, there is room for this as well, right? If there's a story behind it, if there's a connection, maybe there's a slight tweak, like me maybe using less sugar or whatever it is, but still, I think there's room for that as well. I wanted to share. So the thing that I took to that potluck last summer is, I just love this so much, and there's really nothing to it. This is the original card, and it has to have been given to my mom because my mom did not type recipe cards. She always was writing things. I mean, she always was writing things out, even though it was often with shorthand and very little information. But so this must have been given to her. But this chili con queso is something that she made for, I swear, pretty much every single party that I can think of. I mean, not that I have memories of every single party, but I remember this being a regular feature at parties that they held. And the thing, I wish I could pull it out, it's very clunky, but I still have the very copper chafing dish that she always served it in at parties. So it's right there in my cupboard, and I pull that out for parties here. So can you imagine? Oh God, I'm gonna cry. Can you imagine how touching that is to serve the chafing? Oh gosh, I'm sorry, folks, to serve that chili con queso in this dish. And she wrote me a little note. She wrote notes everywhere. She said, you know, the chafing dish is in the back bedroom. It's yours if you want it. I'm like, of course I want it, Mom. Thank you. So keep that in mind too. Maybe that's part of this family treasure, this time together is, we know that we have connection with tools and bowls and spoons and platters. And I also have some old platters that aren't all that special, but they're the ones Mom used often. So that could be, maybe that's also part of your invitation to your family is, you know, think about maybe there's a special tool or whatever it is, because the tangible things in our kitchen are also part of what connects us to these family and these recipes and these memories. Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's just so much around all this. I just love it. So also I've got to show you these hot cheese cookies. So so this is an example of a recipe. I talk about two things often with regard to older recipes that we want to treasure and cherish and preserve, but maybe we don't want to cook them exactly the way they are originally cooked. I'm not sure how much you could see on this recipe card, but it calls for 2 sticks of oleo, which is also margarine. You know, it's that terminology sort of varied around the country in different parts of the world, I think. And 1 small glass of sharp cheddar. So again, that sort of, not sure what you would call it, you know, spreadable cheese, not the same port one I was mentioning earlier, but just the regular sharp cheddar. But you know, it was spreadable, so it had other stuff in there. I'm not sure what all was in there. So I make this a lot these days, but I have updated it to use butter, of course, and I use grated sharp cheddar cheese. So that is that's one of the many things, one of the two key things I end up talking with people about when they want to preserve these recipes is making updates, like small tweaks, like butter for oleo, sharp cheddar for the little glass of cheese, which still does justice and still honors, still cherishes the original, but it's cooked in a form that we're really going to prefer to eat them today. So I think that's something to keep in mind throughout all of the adventures of working with, preserving, sharing these older recipes, is not feeling constrained by the original to reproduce it exactly as is, because I would rather see these recipes used, which means the recipes get preserved, and it means those stories are being told when you're serving that dish. I'd rather that happen with a slightly updated version than this recipe to just live in a box or in a folder and not get used. And again, just live as a memento that's gathering dust instead of being used. So I think that's something to keep in mind. The other like sort of major thing that comes up a lot with these recipes is what I call filling the gaps. And that is the cases where a recipe, like this toffee cookies is a good example, a recipe where, and I know we've all seen these and have a lot of examples, recipes that are in shorthand and they don't include a lot of the details that home cooks today need, because home cooks back then you know, the person who wrote this, my mom wrote this, she's super familiar with the recipe. She doesn't need all the details. She just needs a reminder of ingredients and maybe what temp the oven was or something. But also, so many people were familiar with home cooking back then, and there was a lot more common knowledge about recipe steps. There's a lot of recipes that have sort of a white sauce of some kind that is the base of a dish, and you add, you know, peas and spinach to it or something. And so the recipe might just say, make the white sauce, add the peas and spinach. Where today, most home cooks are going to want to know, what does that mean? How do I make a white sauce? Oh my gosh, I'm sure most of you or some of you have seen that famous scene in Schitt's Creek where they're making, I can't remember what they're making, but they need to fold in the cheese and they have no idea what fold in the cheese means. And it's pretty hilarious. And yes, I saw a note about like a walnut of butter or a teacup of flour. There are a lot of recipes that could use a little more detail for today's home cook. So I think that is part of, again, what I call sort of filling the gaps. In the case of this toffee cookie, it suggests that you literally just take all those ingredients and throw them in a bowl and blend them together. And I think most of us realize that it's going to be better to start by mixing the sugar and butter together first, then add the flour, and then, you know, work in the cinnamon and yolk later. I think it might work if you literally throw everything in a bowl and stir, but I think my mom knew that. She just didn't go into that detail in this particular card. So as you and family who are sharing these recipes, that can be sort of a fun part of the process in terms of sort of the follow-up. If people are bringing a copy of a recipe that could use, you know, a little filling of the gaps, or a little update to sort of use ingredients that we prefer to use today. Or in my case, like, I don't like things as sweet as I used to. I can't eat food that's as rich as as I used to like. So I might be making those kinds of slight tweaks so that the recipe's in a form that I'm more likely to cook today. So those can be maybe some part of a project. Again, if there's some lingering sort of follow-up to a potluck, might be a group effort to sort of fill those gaps, or think about ways to make slight tweaks to the recipe so that it's one that you want to cook, and the people that you share with are going to have enough information to be able to recreate it, and be using ingredients that are more commonly used in our kitchen today. So it's fun. Once you get into these recipes, there is just so much potential for not only the fun of cooking, and I think that's part of the fun too with this family approach, is a collaboration of sorts. I know that my sister is older than me, and so she has different memories than I do, and I often ping her and say, hey, do you remember how mom did this, or when she might have served that? And she provides me with some insights, and it kind of goes both directions. So I think once these conversations start rolling, it's going to feed some really interesting new just sort of paths of memories, and new avenues for just sharing experiences and memories and connections. And it's kind of funny. I mean, again, I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this too. It's interesting. We grew up in the same household and yet have different points of sort of connection and memory. And there's this game, I mean, this is not related to food, but there's this dice game that I feel like, I mean, I learned it from my mom. I have my mom's version of it, and my sister doesn't remember playing it at all. It's like, that's so funny. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's, again, the joy of this is maybe someone brings a dish that you just don't remember, or so that's part of the fun, is going to be the surprise of sort of what comes up, as people bring different things. When it comes to sort of, again, an approach, I think, again, it can be either super duper, it can go from super casual to more structured and anywhere in between. So these are just things to consider. I'm not suggesting you actually do them necessarily, but to help guide people relative, again, to the goal that you have in mind. Do you want to specify on the invitation that it be, in fact, a family recipe, something that's, been passed down from a family member? Or is the goal more just what do your family members hold dear, which might mean that it's a recipe from a neighbor or a colleague or a teacher or something. So just keep that in mind if it's a very, if it's a project very focused on truly just family sourced recipes, keep that in mind in terms of the description, for the invitation. And I think to help them also maybe focus a little bit, it might be a little daunting to say bring something that means bring something that's from the family. I would say to encourage them to think about, again, things with which they feel the strongest connection, and you might throw out some some examples like such as from favorite birthday dinners, or what your favorite your most requested birthday dinner was, or holiday favorites, or from sort of traditions of the family. Maybe it's the summer cabin or whatever, a cousin, annual cousin reunion. That might help spark some ways for them to think about recipes that have a particular connection. And again, I would remind them or encourage them to not feel that it has to be something, elaborate, or it doesn't have to be extra special. It can be an everyday thing too, just comfort food. I mean, we've talked, comfort food often, and maybe that's even a theme. Maybe one of the themes is more sort of holidays and traditions, and that's one theme for a potluck. And then another theme for a potluck could be, this is our comfort food potluck. And you focus on sort of the comfort food aspect, which might be an excuse to bring the Triscuits with that little, old school port cheese, which I honestly like. I'll buy once every year or two just to have a little bit of, just because it feels like comfort, right? And sometimes potlucks, often potlucks have if it's served at mealtime, if it's like a get together that's in the evening and the potluck needs to serve as dinner, sometimes there will be sort of an assignment of sorts by, letters of your last or first name or something. You bring an appetizer, you bring an entree and a dessert. And that's valid, certainly, when you're trying to create a meal. It could be fun to just have dessert and 3 salads and call it dinner. But if you're trying to find balance, that's one approach. But I think that can perhaps be a little constricting for this kind of a potluck. There's certainly ways to balance it out, and I'm sure that's among the options, is finding some way to balance a little organization with not. But one of the things I might suggest, which is what the potluck was last summer that started this all, is maybe hold an afternoon potluck, so that it's sort of between meals, and there's less of a concern that there be balance, and that there be entrees and some vegetables and whatever, a nice mix. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of the timing of it. And if you want to have it as a mealtime, that's great. If you maybe know that a couple of people are definitely bringing an entree kind of thing, or something a little more substantial, so folks get enough substantial food for a meal, or you just have something ready to go as a backup plan maybe. But I do like the idea of an afternoon, just so there's a little more leeway. And if it's more snacky foods, and a mishmash of different things, that's not such an issue. Well, that covers the prime notes. I'm sure, again, I could keep talking about this for quite some time, but Barbara, I might take a pause there, a breath and a drink of water at least, and see if you have any tidbits you want to add, or any insights, or want to drop in any questions.
Again, I apologize for my video, audio. Who knows where this is going to go, but seems to be holding for the moment. That was fabulous. You've left me with so many ideas. First of all, one thing I don't want to miss is that for many of us live in very multicultural environments. And I think of, certainly in my own family, my husband's family is from China. And we work very hard to try to hold together the cultural stories, the history, and so on of the family to make sure that the younger generations um, have that experience. And there's nothing that ties a culture together like food. And when kids grow up with those experiences, bringing it up again and reinforcing it as the elders with the younger kids, it can be incredibly powerful. In our family, is from a north western region of China, and a classic food from that area is a particular water dumpling, it's often called, or soup dumpling, it's often called xiaolongbao. And it's not easy to make. It's basically got a little soup pocket in the middle of this dumpling. The mastery of making that is something that my mother-in-law is just a genius at. She had been teaching it many times. She's now in her 90s, mid 90s, and still absolutely able to make it. But it dawns on me that, even doing things, me, remotely, might be really interesting to be able to, basically have a Xiaolongbao making party and everybody in their own kitchens talking about the food. And me also secretly recording the whole, no, not secretly, but recording the whole thing, because what you're doing is you are producing an artifact of the moment. You're producing like photos, precious moments, and especially with elders, you've got the voice, you've got their voices told, and it doesn't
Absolutely.
matter whether it's xiaolongbao or queso, Texan queso, which has only this much to do with cheese, and or any number of dishes that are from regions. A cookie exchange party. Just imagine everybody that brings a cookie to then sit down in a corner and talk to a box, talk to a person that's recording it as they tell the story of why that cookie. I'm from Berkeley. I make a mean granola. I decided I had to learn how to do that. So, tell us a little bit about ideas, and this maybe everyone can chime in, for ideas for capturing the moment that it happens. And by the way, I'm going to nudge you for scans of those, as many of those recipe cards as you'll let me, to add to this. And I am going to go look up your reference to, I could probably find a Schitt's Creek clip.
Oh,
Just to be
yes, holding
special.
the cheese. What does that mean? It's really hilarious. So for capturing, yes. I think, the gathering is going to hopefully be, I don't want to say long, but it's going to be casual, and unless maybe you make this slightly formalized part of it where, in the case of the potluck I was at, we gathered for a while and we nibbled on every, all the dishes, and we were visiting, and, there was that part of the event, the gathering. And then there was the sort of, hey, let's share stories part. And perhaps there's a way to, someone's just, is in fact just recording those particular snippets when each person is talking for their, 3 or 4 minutes. So it could be a video that someone who is not me could then later piece together, because that's beyond my skill set, but that's a possibility, it seems. And then that could be a video that's preserved. And yeah, again, I think it can be very sort of high tech or low tech. Again, even just, a notebook in which people each share their few sentences about what they brought and why. I'd be really curious, are folks sharing some other suggestions? Your comment, I'm going to just add to your comment about the dumplings that you mentioned. Someone I spoke to, their grandmother was the ravioli, queen of their family, and they did a similar thing with the cousins and everybody together with, I can't remember if it was with her personally, I can't remember physically if they were together in the same room, but there was an event at which grandma made the ravioli, they recorded it, and you know, as happens, she wasn't around a whole lot longer, and it became immediately clear how valuable that was. And they will never regret taking that time and energy to make ravioli with her and have the image of her making it, that video that they can share, the tactile. So I'm all behind that. That's a whole other conversation. That you can try to work some of that into the potluck, the actual cooking together. That might be like even another iteration of a potluck is maybe one where, I mean, it's hard that unless it's just a handful of people, it would be hard to cook a whole lot together, but maybe there is a central dish or two that is a little more elaborate, because often potluck dishes that you bring aren't super elaborate because you're not going to like be eating beef Wellington at the last minute necessarily, or whatever. So maybe you can work in the cooking of a dish, maybe someone's specialty who's still there, I mean, who's around and can be there. And so that's an option, is to actually be in the kitchen a little bit too for part of these potluck get-togethers.
My sons are avid cooks. Most of their recipes they get from YouTube videos that they've seen. We all tend to cook in the kitchen together, and it's like a ballet of sharp knives. You know, you just we haven't skewered each other yet, which is amazing.
It's great. Yeah, cooking together is invaluable.
Yeah. One of the things that hit me was special diets. It's becoming more and more, you know, people glucose intolerant and need gluten-free, and that's been interesting, is to you know, make accommodations for all these different dietary requirements. Have you ever done anything around a special diet?
I haven't personally, because I just don't have many people in my life that are. The one exception, or the key exception, is my husband, who's had diabetes for many years, and he's diet managed. So his diet is the thing that is regulating his health, and so that sort of, you know, that directs a lot of my cooking. You know, like, and he also is allergic to alcohol, so I don't cook with wine anymore. So I am used to that kind of an accommodation. In my own like family circle, I haven't had a lot of occasion to need to do so, but that's a very, very valid and important point to bring up, is that's a perfect example of the kind of updating that recipes can and should, you know, be going through. So again, it's more about cooking it, keeping the memory of that recipe and connection alive in ways that make it possible for people today to cook and enjoy them. So that's a perfect example. And it might be a little bit of maybe a family team effort. It's like, we're going to try a few different ways to make this cookie gluten-free. I'll try the all-purpose gluten-free flour, and someone else will try different, you know, flour mixes or whatever. Yeah. And there could be like a part of this process of updating recipes for certain accommodations, different sugars, or, you know, just different sugar options based on different diet needs, because obviously they have implications for flavor and the outcome of the recipe. You know, the swapping out can vary texture and cooking times and different things. So that can be part of this group effort as a family in updating recipes, is figuring out ways to make those accommodations for the eaters today. For sure. That's a really good point.
Anna, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking, because we in Sweden we celebrate Christmas in a very different way. So we do not have turkey.
Yeah.
Cranberry sauce. We have so much food that we eat for a week. Basically. So when we meet up with family, sort of all the larger family, cousins and everything, we tend to do it as a potluck. Everyone brings different parts of the table, which tends to then be that people bring things that are very regional for where they live and what they're used to, which could differ. So, for example, in my family, my dad is born in the south of Sweden, my mum in Stockholm. So when it comes to having cabbage on the table, a small thing as cabbage, which is just a side dish, my dad wants white cabbage or brown cabbage, which is white cabbage with syrup, which is how we cook it in the south. My mum wants red cabbage, which is cooked with vinegar and apple and stuff like that. And other people want sauerkraut, which is sort of a soured cabbage. And then my brother wants green cabbage, like you have on the West Coast.
Wow. So you could
And
do
then
a whole
then I want the Brussels sprout. So
That's great.
you just with the side dish of cabbage, you will end up with lots of different recipes from different parts of the country.
That is so cool.
And you get the stories around that. So it's a natural thing. Otherwise, normally when we have been doing potlucks, because I've been living in the UK for over 20 years and worked for the MOD, which means that there is a lot of people with different nationalities. So that the potlucks normally had an international theme. So you brought dishes from your home country, or one of your home countries if it was more than one.
That's great. Can I add a little note about Sweden? I was in, the only time I've been in Stockholm was November a while back, and it inspired me to, granted in my Seattle version of it, but it inspired me to make our Christmas brunch dish themed. And I made skivers for the first time. And I cured some salmon, and I can't remember, made some salads, and we had different things. And I froze a bottle of aquavit in ice with holly and things. And I don't know, we just went all in for a Swedish Christmas that year, and it was such a delight.
You should add. I tend to make up my own recipes. So I like risotto, which is very Italian, but I made a Swedish version of risotto that has dill, fresh dill, and crayfish tails.
Oh my gosh, yum.
And instead of using white wine, you use schnapps.
There you go.
Which has nice. The aniseed and cumin flavor that goes well with the dill and the crayfish. So it's
sure.
like a crayfish party, but hot on the plate.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, so that's an interesting.
That could be one of the potluck things. So you could have, instead of having the memories of an old recipe, you could twist it and swap it around and say, if I say a festive cake, what flavors would pop into your brain to make a cake for Christmas and New Year? What flavors is Christmas for you? So Britain, which is not very far from Sweden, they have total different view of a festive cake from what I have. So sure. It wasn't very hard to win the bake-off, if we put it that way.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting, another potential interesting aspect of a potluck is, maybe outside the family unit, because, well, I don't know. I was going to say, like you said, people with different backgrounds bringing dishes that you give a theme to, like a holiday cake, and then you're going to see how many different, that could be a lovely afternoon of just tasting a bunch of different preferences or favorite memories associated with something as focused as that kind of a theme. Or, I mean, it certainly could be in the summertime, you know, pies or fruit dishes, or, I mean, there's so many different ways that a potluck could have a
For
particular
me, it's
theme.
strawberries, summery strawberries and cream.
For sure,
And
yeah.
maybe some sparkling wine with that.
Yeah, so many options. I think, again, that's the fun of this idea, is that a potluck can take so many forms and so many different focus potential for different goals and different types of gatherings and different times of the year and different groups of people that have a particular, you know, interest or something.
I'm absolutely thrilled by the notion of combining family and food and stories that way. And now, with your sensibility for food and entertaining, you know, you're bringing in this mix of perspective in ways of being thoughtful about whether it's during a meal period or not, you know, having it during an afternoon. I think that's why these, you know, cookie parties work. But take the old boring idea of a cookie party and freshen it up with holiday cakes or festive period cakes. Um, and I love the idea of paying attention to ethnicity and origins and family history. In my own case, as tribute to my dad's German heritage, I, like 25 years ago, got all up into German Stollen because I like the Stollen. I like the flavor. And there's a German version that's not raised. It's a quick bread, and the key, of course, is the cardamom flavor. And then I found out it's not German. Swiss.
Oh.
Oops. Well, that's okay. Close enough. It's the good Stollen. But finding
It
ways
could be
to have.
Scandinavian. Scandinavians love
Sorry?
cardamom. Scandinavians
There,
love cardamom.
I need to practice this. You blink hard
Generally,
enough, I probably have heritage from everywhere.
If you do baking of any sort, or if you're using spices, if you're going to use cinnamon or cardamom or something like that, you use a lot, because if it's cinnamon bun, it's supposed to taste cinnamon, not something else.
Right.
So you can't
Right,
run
exactly.
past with the spices. You have to have a lot of spices in.
Past with the spices. Okay, there's another example. I love the expressions that come back into English from wherever they've been, and bring some color and joy. So, gosh, I'm now, as you may know, for Project Kin, we recently introduced, it'll start next month, a speaker series where we will have people just stand up and tell their story. So instead of all these how-to conversations that we usually do on Project Kin, we'll be doing stories themselves. Now I'm thinking maybe we can experiment with a particular episode of the Speaker's Corner with people bringing foods to talk about. But
Like a virtual potluck. Yeah.
A virtual potluck, exactly. And then, you know, we could all bring our own foods to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't see why not. We're thinking about fun things to do for Christmas as it is. Just
I mean, gosh, especially with the holidays coming around.
Everybody celebrates an end of the year holiday.
Right, exactly. It's such a great time in the
Wherever in the
fall
world
to start having these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, anywhere in the world you are, including the summer holidays, they will celebrate in Australia in December.
It's such
holidays
a
are the opposite.
What was I going to say? It's and I think it would be cool somehow, Barbara, to get feedback, like if folks if there's a way to capture some stories, like after this, if someone has a potluck and can share some feedback about the approach that they took and how it went. I think that'd be cool if there's a way to sort of capture and share stories from among folks that give this a shot and see, you know, how it works.
I think what we're going to do is, for starters, just drop them in the notes, because we have. Thank you very much, Diane. Because we have the facility just built into Substack to add comments and to feel free to include links that go somewhere else. I'm liking the idea. You know what I'm going to do? In the questionnaire, I'll add a questionnaire that is simply, do you think we should do a Speaker's Corner episode on food, with people talking about their food? We'll start with that one. And we're already booking out into 2026. So we might even slip in a special episode just to make this happen. And that might be a good way to do it, with the subtlety of inviting. So maybe that's a good place to wrap up, as I know people have had a time constraint. We try to keep this to a tight hour, and my internet is weak. Let me thank everybody for coming, and especially you, for Cynthia, for taking the time to share all of this with us. I think you're going to inspire a whole new round of discussions and storytelling, and truly stories shared with families, which is really the core objective here. To take the comfort food pathway into our hearts and open up with the stories. I know everyone will join me in thanking you, Cynthia, and we can continue the story online in the comments as we take it going forward. So let me close our recording with that, and you can stay on for just a minute or two later. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks again, Barbara, for including me in this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.